So the reason that you can tell this is taken out of context, that Churchill isn't speaking about the larger Islamic world, is because of the numbers. When he says thousands have become brave and loyal soldiers of the Queen, he's referring specifically to the Dervish Empire, or followers of the Dervish Mahdiya, followers of the Mahdi. This is certainly true because census in 1880 that Churchill would have been aware of quoted that there were nearly 41 million Mohammedans in India, so that England is by far the greatest Mohammedan power in the world. In fact, so much so that the Queen reigns over about double as many Muslims as the Caliph himself. So it's easy to see that actually he's referring specifically to this fundamentalist brand of Islam, not the larger sort of Islamic world. Another thing that's quite interesting about the quote is he constantly refers to, throughout this book, throughout his other books, like The History of the English-Speaking People, that the Dervish Mahdiya, the Dervish Empire, were restless fanatics, fanatical hordes. And this thinking is actually in step with sort of Orthodox Islam of the day. Now, what I mean by this is, you have to consider that the Ottoman Sultan, or the Caliph, was basically the successor. And Muhammad Ahmed, and that's his picture over there on the right, declared himself the Mahdi. And to declare yourself the Mahdi means the guided one, which in Islam is roughly equivalent to the Messiah. So you had him running around saying that he was the Messiah, essentially. So you can see how this would upset members of the Orthodox faith, Orthodox Islam faith. So you can see sort of right away that this quote sort of doesn't really work to understand Churchill's views of the Islamic world, certainly not Churchill's views of the Ottoman Empire. So that begs the question, if this isn't a good example of what Churchill's views were, what were Churchill's views of Islam? Well, the truth of the matter is Churchill didn't really focus or reflect much on Islam as a religion at all. And the times that he did were very early on while he was stationed in India. But if we back up a second and consider that Churchill sort of came from the sort of British education system. He was educated at Harrow, and he was sort of indoctrinated with this idea of the British Empire being the most civilizing force in the world. And this was combined with a particular brand of Christianity. And this brand of Christianity, which was very, very specific, very, very British. And the idea was that God was an Englishman. And this was sort of infused into the education system at the time. And Churchill very much takes that on board. What's interesting is Churchill does not take on board the religious dimension. Churchill, after reading Gibbon in India, Gibbon and the Martyrdom of Man by Winwood Reader, basically becomes an atheist. Not just an atheist, he became a militant atheist for some time, and basically kept that line of thinking the rest of his life. He would often obviously reference God in his speeches, but personally, one of his favorite sayings was he was like a buttress. He would prop up the English faith or Christianity from the outside. The next thing to think about in terms of his sort of religious, he did keep this relationship with Harrow and this idea of correspondence and sort of proving that he was taking part in this sort of civilizing mission. So he shared correspondence back with his old schoolmaster, and this is where a lot of his reflections on Islam come. And he and his old schoolmaster, J.B.C. Weldon, exchanged a correspondence. In this correspondence, Weldon was saying that part of the British Empire was they definitely had to have missions, that Christian mission was a part of how the British Empire civilized the world. And Churchill completely refutes that and says that Christian missions were little more than a fruitless errand. And in fact, he tells Weldon that he believes the Asiatic derives more real benefit from the perfect knowledge of his religion than a partial comprehension of Christianity. Now this sort of links back into the infamous sort of River War quote where he basically compares Islam and Christianity and is saying, look, the only real difference between them is science. Another thing that I think is particularly interesting about Churchill's early reflections on Islam is that he's always very careful to differentiate Islam as a religion from what I'm going to call fanatical Islam, politicized Islam. This comes up a lot in the Malacan Field Force, his first book about his experiences on the Northwest frontier. and it comes out in the River War as well. Now this is from the second edition of the River War, and you can tell that he creates a demarcation between Islam and sort of fanaticism. Fanaticism is not the cause of the war. It is a means which helps savage people to fight. What the horn is to the rhinoceros, the sting is to the wasp, the Mohammedan faith was to the Arabs of Sudan, a faculty of offense or defense. It was all this and no more. It is not the reason of the revolt. It strengthened it, it characterized it, but it did not cause it. So it's very clear that Churchill has a sort of atheist worldview about Islam. His idea was that it was a religion, and you can see through his correspondence that he basically thought that each religion sort of evolved to geographically represent the needs of the people in that region. So Europe became Christian, the Middle East became Islamic, and Asia became Buddhist. Now, another thing, and this is going back to some of the stuff that was taken out, that is typically taken out of the River War quote, is when he said thousands had become brave and loyal soldiers of the Queen. This is very useful because it helps illustrate a demarcation in the way Churchill conceptualized the Islamic world. You had those on the inside of the British Empire and those on the outside of the British Empire. When you think about Islam inside the British Empire, obviously you have to consider British India, Egypt, and when you think about Islam sort of outside of it, obviously the Ottoman Empire, Central Asia, parts of Northern Africa, basically the Caliphate. Now, one of Churchill's favorite sayings, increasingly, up to the First World War, was that Britain was the greatest Mohammedan power in the world. And Churchill returns to this thing over and over when he tries to port the Ottoman Empire for an alliance. But the real interesting thing that goes on here that I think is peculiarly Victorian in its sort of construction, and this is pure Churchill because he comes from this sort of Victorian education, this Victorian background, is that when you think about Islam inside the empire, there's this sort of paternal Orientalism that takes place. And that's the notion that we're somehow superior, that God's on our side, God's on the British Empire side, and that we're somehow superior to the Muslims, say, in India, and that we need to make them like us. We need to go out there and help improve their lives because we know what's best for them. And this is very much pure Kipling. You think of his poem, White Man's Burden. This is very much that kind of thing. Now, what's interesting is, on the other side of the coin, you have this sort of romantic Victorian conceptualization of Islam. And that's this sort of nomadic Bedouin warrior, this noble warrior that lives in the desert, and that somehow the noble Bedouin warriors appreciate honor in a way that most men don't understand. That these are great warriors, and it's basically the noble savage idea, but it's applied specifically to Islam's sort of outside empire because they don't need the help of the British Empire. They've sort of got it all figured out. So you have a very interesting situation where these two things sort of oppose one another, but at the same time sort of complement one another. So that sort of sets up or gives you a good idea about how Churchill sees the Islamic world itself, conceptualized. The next thing we'll talk about is the sort of Tory worldview. I'm going to spend a great deal of time on this because it's pretty simple. The Tories, Churchill's father was a Tory. The Tory worldview at this time, the latter half of the 19th century, was very sort of non-interventionist imperialism. It was the idea that it was very sort of pro-Turk. The idea was that Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and Great Britain could form a sort of symbiotic relationship where Great Britain would go in and sort of guarantee the structural integrity of the Ottoman Empire, and then would, in exchange, the Ottoman Empire would keep the Russian Empire at bay, and would keep them away from India in the Great Game of the 19th century, what came to be known as the Great Game. And so the Tories sort of thought to do this basically empire on the cheap, right? That's their model. Now, the Liberal Party at this time was very sort of interventionist. Gladstonian liberalism dictated that you would intervene, that you had to do what was right. And this is, of course, why the River War happens in the first place, is that Gladstone sends Kitchener to go down to take revenge for the deaths of Charles Gordon, which is a whole other episode we can get into in question, if you like. So you have the Tories looking at a sort of symbiotic empire on the cheap type situation, And the liberals looking at like, we hate the Turks, they want the Turks out of Europe. In fact, many liberals go so far as to support the Greeks against the Turks whenever it's possible. So for the latter half of the 19th century, you've got a schizophrenic foreign policy towards the Ottoman Empire coming from Great Britain. But there's no doubt at all that Churchill was of the Tory camp. Now, one of the reasons that the Tory camp was perhaps more visionary than the liberal camp was the Tory camp understood that in order to keep the empire intact in India, you had to please the Muslim contingent. And in order to do that, there was a threat of sort of pan-Islamism. And that's this notion that every Muslim in the world is going to get together and there'll be a giant revolution. And this basically scared the bejesus out of all the Tories, because most of the Tories were clerical workers in India and places like that. So they had been on the front lines, they had seen. So you get this notion that the Tories sort of will do their best to align themselves with the Ottoman Empire to prevent such things from happening. The next bit, oh wait, we'll talk about the father as well. Churchill inherited this sort of view from his father, Lord Randolph Churchill, who was of course a famous Tory. He opposed Gladstone at every chance that he could. He was a huge opponent to Gladstone, so much so that he developed a relationship with Wilfrid Blunt. And Wilfrid Blunt, as Dr. Levicius mentioned, it was an incredible sort of poet and sort of anti-imperialist. I mean, it's insane that Winston Churchill, as we might think of him as a hardcore imperialist, was very good friends with this guy. But they became very good friends later on. And it's because he was friends with Lord Randolph Churchill. What Lord Randolph Churchill would do is he would write to Blunt, who lived in Egypt at this time, and would have him produce reasons why Gladstone was wrong, and then he would report on them in Parliament to make Gladstone look bad. So it sort of threw Gladstone under the bus a little bit. Now, as a result of all this, after Lord Randolph dies, Winston Churchill becomes very good friends with Wilfrid Blunt. And one of the more peculiar things about the relationship was Churchill and he, since 1904, had a sort of reoccurring thing that they would go to a party on Blunt's estate in Sussex and would dress up like Arabs and wander around on his estate and live in tents. It's a Victorian thing, I guess. The other thing is that he was very much, even as Secretary of the State of India, he was a Tory Ottomanist. He always supported the Ottoman Empire whenever he could. And this is something that his wife inherited from him and becomes kind of an issue later on, as we'll see. And the third sort of point that props up Churchill's view of the Ottoman Empire was his personal experience with Muslims on the northwest frontier of India, which of course he wrote the Malachian Field Force about. Now, this is a picture of the 35th Sikhs down here, which Churchill fought with, and that's a picture of an Afridi clan that they fought against. And one of the interesting things about these groups is that Churchill talks about fighting with, and through fighting with these men, he develops a sort of camaraderie. Now, this isn't surprising. One of the interesting stories that he tells from in my early life about it is he talks about the difficulty in translation. He obviously didn't speak the language. So when they were under fire, what Churchill knows is that if he grinned, they would grin. So Churchill decided that he would grin industrially. So you have this situation. Now, what's interesting is that when Churchill would write home, he would never speak of those on the same side as the British forces with disrespect, and he almost and all of his letters are almost completely devoid of racial epithets or common slang. And another thing that I think really differentiates Winston Churchill from his contemporaries who were writing at the same time was that he would often compare and talk about his respect for the opponents they were facing. Now, given this sort of outside Islamic empire, this isn't perhaps as surprising as you think. But what is particularly interesting is one of the things he wrote is they are a brave and warlike race. Nor should it be forgotten that the English are essentially a warlike people. The fact that Churchill is willing to compare the Afridi tribesmen with Great Britain, the most civilizing force in the world, is pretty remarkable.